So thank you everyone for joining us on this next edition of the TPA podcast. Today we're very lucky to have with us Ben Weingarten, who's written recently quite a few things about the World Health Organization, which our viewers would know that we've both spoken and written about quite a few times before. So Ben, welcome. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got interested in the issue of the World Health Organization?
Sure. So by way of background, I'm a senior contributor at The Federalist and a fellow at the Claremont Institute, among other affiliations. And a primary focus of mine in my writing, research, and study is China. I view China, and particularly the Chinese Communist Party, as the greatest nation-state threat to our liberty here in America and in the West more broadly. It's something that that has really been crystallized as Xi Jinping has consolidated his power over the last just under a decade. And this coronavirus, in my view, what I always refer to as the Chinese coronavirus, because the Chinese Communist Party has sought to de-link itself from this pandemic, it, to me, has illustrated to the world in many respects the nature of the Chinese Communist Party. And one element of the sort of grand strategy of that party is to embed itself within international organizations and seek to use them as leverage to push for and pursue its ambitions. And the World Health Organization has been right at the heart of it. And I really got interested, frankly, in the WHO and its relationship to the spread of this pandemic, as well as the Chinese Communist Party, by way of the video of Bruce Aylward, who co-led, I believe, the joint international mission to study the Chinese handling of the outbreak in Wuhan. And he participated in an interview that seemed to go viral, in which he sort of acted as if he didn't hear a question about Taiwan, and then proceeded to essentially toe the Chinese Communist Party line about how Taiwan was part of China. China's response was exceptional. And that led me down sort of researching his prior comments on China, the relationship between the organization and China more broadly, and of course, China's backing of Dr. Tedros several years ago before he was selected to be Director General of the organization. So this really is an episode that I think crystallizes in many respects in the WHO supporting the Chinese Communist Party's narrative in so many different aspects of this pandemic. Truly illustrates the threat really to the life and limb of the free world of Chinese Communist Party control of said international organizations.
And I want to tease out with you just how the CCP got control of the WHO, particularly because it's US taxpayers who are paying for most of the WHO's bill. But it's interesting that you mentioned Dr. Bruce Aylward, because we've been looking at WHO waste and expenditure for a number of years. And he first cropped up on our radar when he was doing Ebola work in Africa. And he went through $400,000 in travel funds close to, because he considered himself too important to travel by Jeep between African towns. He didn't want to travel along, quote, muddy roads, and so went through $400,000 of taxpayer funds when doctors couldn't get basic necessities. And it was just amazing to see the fact that in any way competent organization, he would be promptly fired for their absolute misuse of taxpayer dollars in a way that was just extraordinary. I mean, $400,000 on private helicopters in under a year, and yet he was still promoted and is now a major spokesman for the WHO towing the CCP line. So how did it become like this, and what results did we see for public health because the WHO failed in its mission?
Well, I think there were several major aspects of it. First of all, the Director General of the organization, and as you detailed in an exceptional article that I urge everyone listening or watching to take a look at The Federalist, on Dr. Tedros's previous ties to the Chinese Communist Party. And that stems back, of course, to his time in the leadership in Ethiopia. And Ethiopia has extensive ties with China in terms of development projects and the like. And then Tedros was backed in his bid to become Director General of the WHO by the Chinese Communist Party. And you see the ways in which his relationship to China manifests itself throughout this pandemic. So the first being, of course, the locking out of Taiwan from these various international conferences around the crisis. And of course, Taiwan has handled this pandemic better than perhaps any other land in the world, literally. So, of course, there's a massive cost to the fact that Taiwan's voice was kept out of these international fora where there were discussions about dealing with this pandemic. Also, Taiwan warned the WHO that it appeared that there was human-to-human transmission of this pandemic, which China ignored. The WHO followed China's line in terms of how the pandemic was transmitted, and for several weeks claimed that there were no signs of human-to-human transmission. So there you have the WHO following the Chinese Communist Party narrative on this, as the CCP tried to obfuscate and cover up the nature and scope of the spread of the pandemic. And then after that, you also had the WHO following along with China, saying that it was racist, first of all, to call this a Chinese coronavirus, and second of all, relatedly, that it would be essentially bigoted, although they didn't use those terms, to impose any sorts of travel restrictions around Chinese travelers, when of course, anyone infected in China who traveled to Europe or elsewhere risked spreading it throughout the world. So, and of course, President Trump was attacked as being xenophobic, et cetera, for imposing travel restrictions on China earlier on in the spread of this pandemic. So there are real world costs to the fact that the cover up of the Chinese Communist Party, which was echoed by the narrative of WHO leadership, led to all of these different decision points where essentially the world was led to make the wrong choices, not restrict travel, and not basically cave to a politically correct narrative that the CCP wanted to put forth, not to take seriously the idea that there was human-to-human transmission. And then furthermore, and this is more of a geopolitical element of it, but this idea that you have to de-link the coronavirus from the fact that this came from China and there was an attempt to cover it up by the Chinese Communist Party. Again, why would we ever be looking to the data that comes from the CCP, the narratives that come out of the CCP, the recommendations that come out of the CCP to deal with this, when we know that their entire objective was to try to cover this up, in large part because this poses potentially an existential threat to their regime. It undermines the legitimacy of their regime. And then the last point that I'll make is when Tedros came under fire, as all of these articles started to come out about his apparent biases towards the CCP, Tedros's response was to then lash out in sort of a bizarre rant during a press conference at, of all places, Taiwan, which is the perfect tell, of course, that he's parroting a Chinese Communist Party line, where he basically said, I'm not biased, and oh, by the way, I've been subjected to all of this racist antagonism stemming from Taiwan, and essentially, I'm paraphrasing, that Taiwanese leadership has looked the other way on this, which Taiwan, of course, wholeheartedly denies. So he slandered Taiwan to sort of deflect from the fact that his biases towards the CCP were showing, but in so doing, he was showing a bias towards the CCP because, of course, the CCP is antagonistic and hostile towards Taiwan.
And I mean, that was also Dr. Tedros's, I think, his very first press conference, or the day after he got elected. One of the first things he did was come out strongly against Taiwan. So I know we're running out of time because we wanted to keep this relatively short and sharp. My final question for you would be, to what extent is this simply Dr. Tedros being the issue and we can simply replace him and everything will be fine, as opposed to a more structural issue at the World Health Organization? And
yeah, I think this entire saga must be seen as a microcosm of the much broader issue of Chinese control and leverage over all manner of international organizations in strategically significant areas. Tedros himself is not a Chinese national, though he was backed by the CCP in his bid to become director general. But I would urge listeners and viewers to take a look at the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission, which recently put out a report, the PRC in International Organizations, which lists PRC nationals at the head of all manner of strategically significant international organizations or in various senior roles in those organizations. And of course, if you are one or two steps removed from the top of any one of these organizations, of course, you're going to have influence as well. So there's an element of Chinese dollars backing organizations, which matter. And then, of course, personnel within these organizations as well. And China has a concerted whole of society effort to use every element of national power to achieve the Chinese Communist Party's interests, namely survival, and then expanding its sphere of influence. And every international organization has to be looked at as potential levers for the CCP in executing its grand strategy.
And are people paying attention and actually taking note of this and looking at all these other international governmental organizations?
Well, the fact that the USCC puts out this report is exceptional, and they've done yeoman's work on these issues for several decades. I think what is interesting is that while you have many in the national security and foreign policy establishment in America, for example, who have for decades supported cooperation and collaboration with the CCP in the hopes that someday there will be comedy between our two sides and economic liberalization will lead to political liberalization. I think that's been proven to be folly. But the interesting thing is the dichotomy between where leaders are responsible for crafting these policies and the general public. And if you look at the American public, 62% of Americans, according to a recent Pew poll, consider China to be a major threat, and 9 in 10 consider communist China to be a threat. I think that tells you that the public is far more aware of the dangers that are laid out quite clearly just to public health from the coronavirus pandemic, the Chinese coronavirus pandemic. The people are far ahead of where much of the establishment is, I'm sorry to say, although the Trump administration itself has completely rejected, I think, the kind of underlying premises that have guided our establishment with respect to China. And you have seen other world governments as well, including the UK, for example, argue that there must be a reorientation in policy towards the CCP, including in particular, potentially not letting Huawei build its 5G infrastructure. And you're seeing stories like that abroad.
Okay, well, thank you. Look, thank you once again for taking the time to speak with us today. And I think that report and the influence for other international organizations is something that our viewers will be particularly interested in. So thank you very much once again for all of your time.
Thank you, Tim. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.